Hello, Greyhounds, and welcome back to episode 8 of our NTI book chats. Today we are reading about Susan B. Anthony, and the title of this chapter is Voter Revolts. Imagine living today in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, where women can't vote or own property, can't get an education, a divorce, or equal pay, where being beaten by your husband is okay, and where women can't speak out without being terrorized. Susan B. Anthony was born in a country like that, the United States. In 1820, one half of the population in America had as few rights as a potted plant. The other half, men, liked it that way. Women were trained not to complain about it or disagree. But then along came Susan B. Anthony. She wouldn't keep her mouth shut about it. We've all said, but it's not fair, for something or other. But Susan said it once and then she couldn't stop. Fair was fair. And there was no room for compromise. No amount of belittling, hate mail, or angry mobs could stop this pioneering pain in the butt from her dedication to getting women their equal share of rights and the vote as citizens of the United States. Except she herself never got it. Susan was number 2 of 7 siblings born into a traditional Quaker household. She didn't have to worry about sharing her toys and games with her brothers and sisters since Quakers didn't allow them. They lived by the words of the famous Quaker prayer. "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be, and when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight." The main delight Susan enjoyed as reverence for the Lord, which came with no singing unless it was slow, no dancing, especially not slow, and no art. Susan had a frill-free childhood of plain talk, gray dresses, and endless chores thanks to the 11 of her dad's mill employees living at her house. But underneath that gray dress, that looked like a piece of concrete with a hat on top, some serious rebellion was brewing. Meanwhile, all she did when she wasn't at school was help her mom cook and clean. Her male school teacher wouldn't allow her to learn long division because it was thought that if a girl used her brain too much, her baby-making parts would die. Susan embraced the core Quaker idea that everything must flow from what one experienced. And she definitely knew what her teacher said was wrong. Eventually, Susan went off to boarding school, where all she mastered was how to perfectly dot her I's. Yet Susan became a teacher too, eventually running a school herself. By then, her dad had given up the mill to become a teacher. Susan made only 1/4 of what her dad earned, and only half of what her teacher brother earned. No wonder they didn't want women to learn math. Out on her own, away from the Quakers, Susan became less Quakerly, dropping the plain talk of thee and thou, and getting herself plaid dresses, bonnets, and dates to some dances. What she didn't like at the dances was men drinking, because drunk men often went home and beat their wives and kids. If these women wanted to get away from their abusive husbands, it was illegal to take their kids with them. And since any money or property they owned belonged to their husband, the women were usually trapped. But Susan wasn't, and she spoke up about it on their behalf. Hardly anyone was ready to listen to a spinster advocating that women leave their husbands. Most people thought women, especially Susan, with her radical ideas, were to be seen and not heard. Men saw no reason to change the model of what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine too. The completely slanted male press called her a shrieking shrew. But Susan was just getting started. Fighting to ban alcohol grew into something she really wanted to blab about: women's rights. The difficulty of changing people's minds about women's place in society was practically insurmountable back then. And for this, Anthony needed sensible flat boots on the ground. Along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a team of other women, she started a women's uprising, the women's suffrage movement, out of nothing but their wits and their voices. Without the internet or anything else with a wire attached to it, the only way to get out the message was to meet and greet, talking it up with everyone they saw. and to see as many people as they could. They had to get moving. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children, so she was a tad distracted. Susan B. Anthony never married, designating her the one who packed her bags and went around trying to improve women's lives. She traveled in trains, open buggies, and sleighs, circulating petitions, holding meetings, and going door to door. Her message: women should be allowed to own property. Wake up. Women are not doormats, and now's the time to stop acting like it. Both men and women behaved rudely when they heard that, and they slammed doors in her face and jeered and ridiculed her, but she kept going, renting halls and giving speeches. Some people couldn't wait for her to catch the next wagon out of town. A woman speaking in public was considered crass, not to mention all that thinking she was doing while her baby-making parts died right in front of everybody. Those who stayed and heard Susan's resolve for equality and her clear, musical voice were moved by her good sense, heart, and charisma. But then some would throw fruit at her. It didn't matter if 1 person or 300 showed up. She had the simple yet bothersome truth to tell them. The way women were treated wasn't fair. Along with inequality of women, the other most unfair thing in America was slavery. Susan became active in the anti-slavery movement too. The abolitionists put Anthony's organizing talents and her never-give-up attitude to work. People sat with pistols in their laps, but that didn't stop her. She got men elected to Congress who would vote for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery. But then no one helped her in return. The politicians didn't lift a finger, sticking the word male in the 14th Amendment that gave the right to vote to all citizens. That one word meant half the population was left out. The politicians had used her to get elected, but deep down they considered women's causes dead weight. They got men their rights and nothing more, and they wanted Anthony to zip it up and go home and bake something. So Susan B. Anthony and her women's rights were left in limbo. It was enough to make anyone else give up and go home, but Anthony couldn't. Women were taxed, imprisoned, and hanged just like men. How could they be excluded from voting? It wasn't fair, and why wouldn't anyone listen? That's when Anthony took action in a way that everyone was sure to hear about. It wasn't in another meeting or conference or informative flyer. This time she simply broke the law by registering to vote. But not really. The law said citizens and the privilege of voting, so she believed she had every right to do it. On November 5th, 1872, Anthony and 14 other women voted. 9 days later, a U.S. Marshal casually told her to come down to the office whenever it was convenient for her. She asked, "Is this the way you arrest men?" She even wanted to be handcuffed, but the marshal wouldn't do it. They asked her dumb questions like she dressed like a man when she voted. Refusing to post bail, Susan hoped to be put in jail so she could claim illegal imprisonment and take her case all the way to the Supreme Court. But they wouldn't put her in jail. At her trial on June 17, 1873, the United States of America versus Susan B. Anthony, she wasn't expecting to be judged by a jury of her peers. It was a room full of men in suits. Women weren't allowed to be on a jury or to be admitted to the bar, so they couldn't be lawyers or judges either. Her attorney called her as a witness, but the judge declared that Susan B. Anthony was incompetent as a witness because she was a woman. Say what? Then the judge told the jury that Anthony was guilty, and that was that. Susan B. Anthony didn't have a chance. She didn't have to pay the fine or go to jail, but they did imprison the 3 men who had registered her to vote. She had failed. I'm feeling today that life doesn't pay. The way seems so blocked up to me on all sides. But that feeling didn't stop her. Anthony kept on failing for 33 more years, fighting for women's rights to vote. Anthony died in 1906. Women didn't get the right to vote for 14 more years after that. It took thousands of women suffragettes marching in the streets to demonstrate that one person can make a difference, and so can one vote. Susan B. Anthony cared little about her own comforts or personal rewards. Her radical idea that rights for women would transform everything for the better was way ahead of its time. Without equal rights, a country will not be a strong one, nor a wealthy and peaceful one. Nothing is more revolutionary than fairness and kindness, and the belief that human beings are linked but should not be ranked. In her lifetime, she failed to see her ultimate goal achieved, women voting. But it was the United States government that failed her. She was the good that was possible for humankind long before humankind caught up with her. And there is still more work to do. When she said, "Failure is impossible," Susan B. Anthony did what everyone should do after failing. She didn't give up. Thank you guys so much for listening, and stay tuned for episode 9.